Welcome, welcome. Delighted to have everyone here, friends that are here. Thank you. Great to see you all. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president of here at CSIS. And the reason I wanted to do this session is because I had the enormous privilege of working with Robin for 7, 8 years, I think it was. When I first came to CSIS, Robin was here. And he became the chief operating officer and taught me everything. I mean, I didn't know anything when I came here. And I certainly didn't know how to run a think tank. And Robin did, and he tutored me. And I still remember the day when he walked in and he said, I just need to tell you, I've been offered a position to be the head of Chatham House. Oh, shit. You know. And it crushed me. But I knew it was such a great opportunity for Robin, and I certainly wanted him to have that opportunity. And it was also a vital opportunity for Chatham House, actually, because I'm not sure Chatham House would have survived without you, Robin. I mean, I think they were selling the furniture when you were...
This is on the record, yeah, I'm just checking.
Yeah, this is
being live streamed, I'm just checking.
No, it's live streamed to the world, yeah. But I think they were selling the furniture to keep things going until you got there. And you saved them. And so hats off to you, congratulations. And I don't know how you're able to do it. I guess it's maybe because are you retired?
I'm writing, so
you're
I'm clearly not retired.
He's not really retired. He was... I've looked at his calendar, and he's busier than I am. So he's not really retired, but he has had a chance to write a book. And we're going to explore all of that today with all of you. Now, the book is not yet available here in the U.S., because it's a British publisher, and they still look down on us as the colonies, distant, backward colonies. But it will be published. You'll all get a little QR code if you want to order it, so you'll know how to do that. So take a look. Oh, well, it says a Brit. Okay.
Yeah, Amazon it just takes a little longer to get over, but it gets there.
So what we're going to do with this, because it hasn't been published here yet, and you haven't had a chance to read it, I'm going to frame more fundamental questions, to basically designed to have Robin explain why he wrote the book, and what it's all about. And so, one of the book obviously is about the new Cold War, okay? And so obviously it's about the tensions between China and the United States. Robin makes the point that, it's not just hard military power. There's a fundamental idea that divides us. It's how we see the world and how China sees the world. It's the way that we see the role of government vis-a-vis society. In our country, the government's responsibility is to balance the rights of individuals and the needs of society, and to strike that balance. In China, the party is there to make sure everybody follows the party's ideas, and so this is rule of law by law kind of thing. So why don't you elaborate on why you think that's the dividing point for this new Cold War?
John, happy to, but first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to be, I was going to say back here, but I can't say that because I never actually worked in this building, and I love John with his usual self-deprecating style. Somehow, I spent all my time in 1800 K Street, and then I leave, and this unbelievable cathedral to think tankery has emerged under your leadership. So, as you all know here, I learnt what I learnt from the master. So, John, thank you very much. And it was a huge privilege to be your number two
to have you here, Robin.
For as long as I was. And although our building is older, it has certain attributes and a rule, which is very useful as well. But it was an absolute pleasure. So it's a pleasure to be back and actually to be on this stage and looking at that with an incredible view that you have here. And great to see some colleagues who I'm recognizing around the room, as well as younger generations who probably weren't alive when I was here.
Yeah, a whole bunch of you guys showed up. Well, good to have you here.
It's a good mix. So, but I'm very, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about the book. And you've cut right to the chase, because like you, maybe others, I go to China now and again. And I would try to go once a year if I could prior to COVID. And then I've been I was just there actually last week in Beijing, just trying to get a feel for what's going on. And my sense is that from a Chinese perspective, certainly in the think tanks and possibly in the government, there's an idea that the contest between the US and China is great power competition. And great power competition is something that logically should be manageable, because it's about rising capabilities on defense, ambitions for technology. It might even be thinking about which one will have the greater global footprint economically. It's the Belt and Road Initiative, China trying to catch up with the kind of investment Europeans and the US made around the world. And that if we could just work out how to peacefully coexist, and America would give some room for China to rise, maybe even be its equal at some point, and certainly its equal in the Asia-Pacific region, then great power competition could be bounded. And I found myself saying back, 5 years ago, and I've said it since, you're missing a key part of this. This is, I believe, a contest, a competition that is partly ideological. And you noted the key parts to it. It's two very different ideas of what makes stable governance that can deliver opportunities to citizens, and in the end, what makes stable international governance. And the stable governance, as seen in Beijing, is top-down. Mm-hmm. It is an elite that are well-trained, that know best, set the course for the country. They listen out a little bit. They listen to majoritarian positions, or some people call the mass line. But then ultimately it is up to citizens to follow that decision to be made by government. And it's up to government to try to deliver the environment in which people can be successful, that you follow what the government says. There is no room for civil society. There's no room for the rule of law. There's no room for separation of powers. And obviously, if you're in China, you think that could work, and they've got several thousand years of history of it. And they look at our system, and I'm here in an interesting week, to put it mildly, and they say, you could say Brexit, but you could also say January the 6th. You could say all sorts of things and say that system of government is not fit for purpose. Of course, if we're sitting in Washington or London or wherever it is, we look at our system, and as Winston Churchill famously once said, democracy is the worst system of government ever invented, except for any other. And the view is that the very competition and the chaos that we undertake leads ultimately to renewal, to exposing weaknesses. You could say weaknesses have been exposed in presidential debates. Weaknesses have been exposed with the British government of Liz Truss. And you adapt and you change. And it might be chaotic and messy, but that very contestation, the transparency of freedom of expression, of the rule of law, of separation of powers, is what chaotically keeps us creative and keeps us on the right path. It would be fine if we could both coexist, but I'll finish with this point as an opening kind of comment. I think we each fear each other's system. Mm-hmm. Definitely China fears that America fears them, and that color revolutions, to use the term after the Orange Revolution, the first one of 2013 in Ukraine, that America and its allies are out to try to promote democracy and undermine top-down systems of government, including theirs. And therefore, they must do all they can to defend themselves from it and keep it away, and that's led to an even more centralized form of government recently in China. Now, do we fear their system of government? At some level. I mean, why are we thinking of forcing ByteDance to divest from TikTok? Because there's a fear that at some level, the Chinese system is almost deploying TikTok into European societies to algorithmically take advantage of our weaknesses. We're worried about surveillance backdooring its way in through their technologies. But also I think we fear that any centralized system of top-down authoritarian government in the end is ultimately insecure and paranoid. And because it's insecure and paranoid, it needs to enlarge its circle of stability and make sure it has buffer zones around it and space around it to be safe. We've seen Vladimir Putin do this explicitly, and you might say that Chinese influence in ASEAN is similar. And because they do that expansion and expand out, the danger always is that any internal insecurity will end up being externalized. So we fear Their system of government is unstable, and if it's unstable, it's going to lead to global instability. So we each, it's not just different systems of government that could live and let live. Each fears the other, because it fears the other. The reason I'm calling it the New Cold War, and that is contested, as you know, in certain circles, is because I think it has an ideological basis and not simply a great power competition basis.
You know, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's a theme of the efficiency of evil, that somehow evil is always so efficient and good is so hard to accomplish. And that gets played out, I think, in our perceptions of each other here. Robin, you say in the earliest paragraphs of your book, and I'm quoting, "We stand at the very beginning of a new Cold War with no sense of how or when it will end." But then later on, you write to say that this is not at all going to be like the old Cold War. Why don't you tell us what that means?
I think it is not like the old Cold War, partly for how we are starting it and how it's beginning. I titled one of the chapters, "Reversing into the New Cold War." In a way, the Soviet Union and the United States and its allies ended World War II, and knew, even from before the end, Churchill was trying to reorganize, in essence, the Allied nations to resist the Soviet Union, even before we finished defeating the Nazis, because they knew those two systems were completely incompatible, that certainly Soviet-led communism had a sort of global ambition to it, and that it would need to be resisted. And so we moved pretty quickly into a separation. Marshall Plan, you know, establishment of NATO, these things all happen incredibly quickly. The United States and China in particular, as I said, have reversed into a Cold War from a period where they thought engagement actually would be good for each side. The responsible stakeholder idea is put out by Bob Zoellick in his day, that if we opened up to China and China opened up to us, that ultimately their system of government, although different, would, you know, the sharp edges of the ideological difference I've just described would be smoothed out. It might even become a bit more like us, because our system of political organization was more evolved. So I think we really started through a different lens. And so we've ended up getting incredibly integrated. And I start, like some other people I've noticed since then, have also alluded to the famous balloon incident. You know, to the point where Chinese surveillance technology uses American technology to be able to drive some of that surveillance capability. And I say, if you would open up an F-22, the one that shot down the balloon in early 23, you would have found Chinese technology, or at least microelectronics, inside a lot of the American capabilities, the avionics of the F-22. We've ended up interconnecting and integrating, and now we're trying to sort of pull away from each other and see, can we hold it without it splitting? That was never experienced between the Soviet Union and the US. And most importantly on this, I think, is the different global outlooks of the Soviet Union then, and even Russia today, and the United States and its allies, which is that China ultimately depends on global engagement for the survival of the Communist Party, and therefore the survival of China. It does not have the resources that the Soviet Union and Russia does. It needs to be engaged in global markets. It needs to be able to export to those markets to deliver the kind of increase in human economic opportunity that, in a way, the Soviet Union ignored and partly collapsed as a result of ignoring. So they need a stable world, a world which is safe for authoritarianism, but is also safe for global trade and safe for engagement. And so I think that is one of the optimistic elements. We could be in a Cold War where we do not trust each other, where there's an ideological difference, where we're testing the boundaries of how far we pull away from each other. But in the end, there's almost a sort of discipline to it, potentially, that we didn't have in the first Cold War. I mean, I think there are a lot of other differences in there as well. I won't go through them all now. You know, you've got an Atlantic and a Pacific interconnection that we didn't have last time. And there are other big topics to do with the role of the countries in the global south, but I'll come to those later. I think that main difference is China is looking for international stability and global engagement. Russia is still looking for global chaos because they benefit from chaos. China does not. And this becomes an interesting debate, I think, even as we think about who might be leading the United States in 2025. Can we understand that differentiation? The difference between this Cold War and the last one? Because I do sense in parts of Washington, in London occasionally as well, there's a sort of conflation of the Soviet Union and that Cold War with this one. And I think part of the reason I wanted to write the book is say, it is a Cold War, but there's some really profound differences.
Yeah, only
if we know the differences.
Yeah, we like the Cold War. It worked out pretty well. And we understood
the last one.
The last one. So we tend to... But let me, if I could, ask you to reflect on this kind of the central conundrum, and that is, one of the truisms of international relations is that a hegemon creates antibodies to itself. The United States was the hegemon, and I remember when a French president talked about us being the hyperpower. It was just these antibodies that come when people resent that there's really a powerful country. And so I look at Asia, and everybody in the region is apprehensive about China as a power, as a tremendous power. And so they want us there as a way to give some security against this hegemon. But China sees that and interprets it as containment, that it's our design. They don't really seem to understand it's partly them. How does that figure in your analysis of this problem?
Well, I may or may not have captured that in my analysis, but let me just answer your question straight up. And to my mind, hegemons tend to be benign. Let me rephrase that. Hegemons are providing rules and providing a structure within which others could prosper, in my interpretation, at least, of hegemons. When that phrase about the hyperpower, which was probably Jacques Chirac, if I'm thinking about that, unipolar moment, it was because they believed the United States had gone from being a hegemon that was providing rules and stability, even if it was a little self-selected in which rules it followed and which it didn't, which is kind of comes with the territory, to becoming a hyperpower that in a way was ignoring its responsibilities as a hegemon for providing stability, and then we would give a certain amount of deference, rather than antibodies. So the antibodies really came out when America went from being that post-World War II supplier of security and even allowing Europe to benefit from preferential trade access to the American market, as we did at a certain point when we rebuilt, to becoming a power that was abusing its position, you might say, as the hegemon. So where is China in that journey? China, as we know, has no alliances. It has refused to ever accept being allied to anyone, because an alliance creates obligations. Obligations removes freedom for action. If I can think of a certain US president who might take that view, but in any case. So it is really, it is limiting of flexibility and of sovereignty. And so I don't think of China as a hegemon. It is providing a market, which many of those countries have benefited massively from. But I think most countries in that region see it as either self-interested or becoming a hyperpower, becoming what you described as that thing that creates the antibodies. And the antibodies clearly are there, because China has never formally said, we want to do this all with you, and we're going to compromise some of our own sovereignty to help you and welfare for you to do better. The sense is China is principally about itself, and it wants stability globally, but beyond that, it really doesn't want to provide rules or predictability. The South China Sea is a good example. What does it want to do, the South China Sea? It wants to negotiate with each country individually. Doesn't want a code of conduct, doesn't want UN law of the sea adjudication. Now, maybe it's shifting. That's why I'm trying to think how to answer your question. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was sort of China at least instigated, maybe partly to counteract the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was initially US instigated. So maybe the Chinese leadership is trying to learn how to be slightly more benignly hegemon, but that's definitely not where they're starting. So as I think about your question, we're in different places. America was a benign hegemon that seems to have lost some of its sense of what comes with that responsibility.
Its nobility. Yeah.
And China may or may not go the other way, where it's been overly aggressive. And I describe in the book how China is still trying to establish its borders. I mean, China is in a completely different stage of its journey. It's still literally trying to work out where the limits of China are, whether it be Taiwan, whether it be with India. It was with Vietnam at one particular point. America, Canada, Mexico, oceans,
Well, we did invade them both.
Yeah, but that was way back then. Then you became a benign hegemon
ago.
after doing your heavy-duty business. So it was a different phase. So I suppose the big question, I think it's a very interesting, provocative question. Can China become more of a benign hegemon? It is certainly not yet, may never be, because it's so skeptical of commitment to others. It's so about committing to itself.
Well, let me ask this slightly differently. It seems to me that there have been three fundamental questions between us. The first question is, can the United States contain China? And the answer is no. I mean, nobody in Asia wanted to be a part of a containment strategy. The second question was, can China push the United States out of Asia? And the answer is no, because everybody that wants us there.
Yeah.
But this raises then the third question, which is a central conundrum. As we work out our relationship with each other, what's the role of everybody else in Asia? I mean, for us, they're allies. For China, they're vassal states.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile this? Because you say we have two fundamentally different value structures, and yet the central point of contention is over what is the relationship for everybody else in Asia?
Yeah, that's, again, a very good question. It's the danger of having John Hamre moderating you on this stuff. I thought it was a benefit, but I knew it'd be a challenge as well. Allies versus vassals. I think the question here is whether, and it gets a little bit to what I come to later on in the book, there's an opportunity here for countries across Southeast Asia, which is your immediate proximate region you're talking about, but I could apply this as well to other parts of the world, but let's focus on Southeast Asia, to flip the problem. And rather than seeing this as a dichotomy that you can't resolve, we can't contain China, China can't push us out. In that viewpoint, the countries of Southeast Asia have to play one side or the other. One of those two roles. They have to be with one side or the other. My sense of countries in the region is that they, and I've described in the book, they reject the new Cold War. They simply reject being the contest. They will try to play both sides. And in a way, we're almost empowering them to play both sides because we both need them. China needs the countries of Southeast Asia much more than it did before because it needs to invest there to export to us because their labor costs are getting too expensive, because we're putting obstacles to their ability to export directly to us. We need them. We need access to their minerals. We need access to their growing markets. Certainly if you're in Europe with aging demography and so on, this is a great growth opportunity for us. And just to give one anecdote on this, I was at a dinner in Beijing last week, convened by one of the embassies, and it was strangely and remarkably, they brought together what I'd say literally a representative sample of countries from the global south. Somebody from Africa, somebody from Southeast Asia, somebody from Latin America, a couple of other parts of the world. And an Indonesian participant had been mentioned by another, somebody from Egypt, saying, well, Indonesia is looking to join BRICS, like Turkey, like Thailand. The BRICS are enlarging. They're moving to the Chinese side of the ledger. And the Indonesian participant replied and said, yeah, absolutely. We're very interested in joining the BRICS. We see some upside here economically, principally the new development bank, and we'll talk about that later if you want. But he said, I think we'll probably be joining the OECD first. Yeah? We've already had our bid into the OECD, and we reckon that'll be the first one. And so rather than, them having to, what's the role of everyone else? The role of everyone else is almost a discipline on us, on the extent of our contest. We're still, and I say one of the biggest differences between this Cold War and the last is not just countries in Southeast Asia, but maybe ultimately in Latin America, hopefully even more so in Sub-Saharan Africa. They will not be proxies, they will not be passengers, they will not be spectators of this new contest. They are going to triangulate, leverage, use it, and I think they can. Yeah. So I have a more optimistic outlook, do you see what I'm saying? And maybe that then changes our positioning on it. We can't say you're with us or you're with them. Or you help us contain or you don't. Do you see what I'm saying?
I think that's the key thing. I mean, if you want to keep them as being partners and allies, you don't say you're either with us or them, because they can't. The world can't be that binary.
Exactly.
In this, Robin, let me ask if I could. I looked at we had the NATO summit, 75th anniversary here last week, and we had the defense minister of Australia, we had the president of Korea. I mean, we've got Asians who are coming to NATO. Okay, we have NATO that is inviting, Asian political leaders to come to events in Europe. I mean, I've always felt it was unnatural, because ultimately NATO was about the political evolution of Europe. I mean, that really was its foundation. But now it looks like Europeans are seeing NATO as a larger global security structure. Would you reflect on that?
Yeah, again, a great question, and something I definitely go into in the book, given my own history with Chatham House on the Europe side and transatlantic side. I don't think it's NATO going global. I think what it is, and this is tied partly into the very dynamic role that Russia has had, Vladimir Putin and his leadership have had, in defining the contours and shape and pace of the new Cold War, as well as China. Once Vladimir Putin decided to do the full-scale invasion of Ukraine he decided whenever he did, but he did it in February 2022. Obviously, it brought war back to continental Europe in a way we had thought was gone, and with horrors that we thought had been banished. But it reminded Europeans how much we relied on America. And we were not ready, are still not ready, to take over responsibility for our own security. And that need for America, which manifested itself, you saw it in the 75th anniversary summit, trying to get another commitment of funding, trying to get a bilateral security, which we secured, agreement with the United States, having already signed them with a number of other European countries, including the UK, Germany, France, Netherlands. That reliance on America's engagement in European security is now perceived in European capitals as being partly dependent on proving to America that we also care about America's principal security concern, which actually isn't Europe, it's the Asia-Pacific, China/theater world. And European leaders are bright enough and knowledgeable enough and insecure enough to know that we need to treat Pacific security seriously if we're going to make sure that American political leaders won't say at some point, look, you look after Europe, because I'm afraid we're focusing on Asia-Pacific, and you're not helping us. You seem to be, what you expect us to be responsible for this. We've got a much bigger deal going on with China, all the stuff you just talked about in the region. So there's an awareness that although we don't have big military capacity to send out there, but having a reciprocal forces access agreement like the UK does now with Japan, that having the French doing freedom of navigation operations along with the Indians and the Americans, that being there politically almost as much as economic is important. And the flip side of it is, I think those countries, those American allies in the Indo-Pacific, understand that actually having Europeans be part of that process is useful, and to show that, they also need to demonstrate some engagement in European security. So you had at the beginning, early in 2022, for the first time ever, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, Japan, imposing sanctions on Russia, never done before. The Japanese, my last count I saw, were over $12 billion worth of support to Ukraine. one of the largest, financially at least, supporters of Ukraine. South Koreans trying to find a way to channel supplies through.
Especially now. Yeah.
But certainly showing up also. And they attended, you mentioned the attendance, but they've attended the last 2 summits. Prime Minister, full, in fact, this is the first time I think Albanese didn't come, but the last Prime Ministers have been at the last 2 summits. And so you've got NATO saying we care about China, and you've got the Indo-Pacific countries saying we care about Europe. Not just because they want to show that demonstration, and maybe they need to hedge a bit in America that might not be with them, and they may need the Europeans more actively, but because they also see in their own region Russia teaming up with China. Who's going down the Taiwan Straits? The Russians are accompanying the Chinese on those patrols. Russia's in, with this deal with North Korea. The Japanese are not going to get the Kuril Islands back, arbitrate for how many years and gone. So the closer relationship between Russia and China is almost making those countries in the Pacific saying, you know what, Russia and China are now a linked risk to us, and we need to amplify our own alliance network. We don't want NATO necessarily here, but we do want to be part of what I clunkily call a more Atlantic-Pacific partnership. I mean, somebody's got to come up with a better term than that.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about G7 plus.
We'll come to that. Yeah.
So I think there's an effort to come together on this.
When Barack Obama gave his famous Pivot to Asia speech back in January 2012, I think it was, the unspoken part, he didn't say this, but the unspoken part was Russia was now Europe's problem, right? I mean, for the first time in our history, we said Asia was our first priority, not Europe. We never said out loud that it was up to Europe to take care of Russia, but we found out we couldn't do that. Partly because Russia became far more malevolent, and partly because Europeans still haven't gotten their poop in a group. Do you see that changing?
That technical term, I recognize.
Not the technical term.
I remember your technical term.
It's a think tank term.
Think tank term. Do I see that changing? It is changing, yeah. But it's Europe, so it's slow. It's commitments, and then the commitments aren't fully followed through. It's a Zeitenwende in Germany, a new 100 billion, but then, oh, hold on a minute, how does that fit with our Schuldenbremse, the debt brake, and it's constitutionally amended, and there's a constitutional court gets a challenge to being able to borrow money to do it. So it's slow, but you just look at the numbers. It is now over 70% of European countries spending 2% of GDP on defense. Some of that number is a little massaged in some cases. Some have put Ukraine aid inside that number, but not unfair. America's defense figures have all sorts of stuff in there. They've got nothing to do with Europe, and are tied into all sorts of very particular American requirements. So I think on spending, we're getting our poop in a group. Slowly, but it is in that direction because we feel the Russian threat. We see it. It is visible. It's inescapable. And we fear America may not be there. And it might be sooner than we realize. So there's a sort of desperation between wanting to do it, and then obviously, we'll come to that maybe later, all of the problems of Europe, which are bigger and political, which are similar to the ones here in America. But the direction of travel is to investing more in defense, and there's a realization, maybe actually that's jobs. Maybe that's investing in industry in Europe. Hey, if Russia's GDP can be held up by defense spending, why can't ours? And the Russian stuff keeps getting destroyed, and ours maybe will carry on, existing for a while. So there's if you look at the Labour government, it's literally just come out with the importance of its defense and the new MOD will be part of defense. So I think it's happening there. UK we'll come back to that later on, I think is going to be part of that process. Technologically, obviously, we're going to rely a certain amount on America, but defense and security these days is not simply about defense, it's about energy security. Europeans are treating that much more seriously. Reverse flow, LNG plants, investment in cyber capabilities. We're getting there. So I don't know, will we, we'll never achieve everything we should achieve, but the direction of travel is about taking European defense seriously, about wanting to step up and fill in for gaps that we feel America won't be there for later on. And the Indo-Pacific strategies are part of that.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you the question that everybody in this room has in their mind, and that is, if Donald Trump is elected in November, what the hell are you guys thinking, and what happens to NATO?
Well, I think the lesson from last time is no one really knows. So I'm going to also not know, but I'll still answer your question because we're up here and we should talk about it, and love to hear other people's views as well. We know what Trump said. It was just a big, in-depth thing of the 2018, I think it was, NATO summit in the FT magazine, and blow by blow, hour by hour, and people trying to change speeches. So I'm withdrawing from NATO weren't in there. Then Trump coming in and trying to say it. I think the impression and the lesson learned from last time, which is dangerous because it may be wrong this time, was that Donald Trump was deeply upset with Europe for very good reason. He was absolutely right when he said, hold on, so we are spending more money to defend you from a Russia, post-2014, that you buy the bulk of your gas and oil from. I don't get this at all. I've had enough. Time for you guys to take over, or we're pulling out, change the system, or we're out of here. And as I write in the book, of course, the problem with Trump is he's wrong even when he's right. And he's often right, but he has a way of then being wrong afterwards. But I think on this particular issue, where are we now? We are not importing our oil and gas we are importing gas, but we can do that later on. Much less, 40% of imports down to roughly 10% in the space of a year and a half, 2 years. Remarkable change around. We're spending way more in defense. And because we spend more in defense and we don't have enough of defense industrial base, we're buying a lot more American kit, which is the other thing he wanted us to do as well. So I think he, as he's declared before, he can declare victory. So there's a kind of hope amongst some people that he doesn't need to leave NATO because we did what he said. And we're all going to be up there saying, you were right, if he wins. Please stick with NATO. We are, and he throws out these numbers. He has to in his campaign of how many hundreds of billions America is spending on Ukraine. But if you look at the Kiel Institute numbers, which are the most reliable ones, Europe has spent and is committed more than America. Less on defense spending, but more cumulatively on financial aid and defense. If you look ahead, we're well ahead of the United States on the commitments that have just been made. So I think there's a hope that somehow by picking up more of the responsibility, we'll be okay. The big worry I have is trade. Yeah. Because what you cannot disguise, and I did a little piece in Foreign Policy magazine a couple of months ago on the back of issuing the book in the UK about the G7. And again, without getting to the G7 too much, but one number that struck me as I looked at them, the G7 has a cumulative, had a cumulative trade surplus in goods, which is all that Trump cares about, in 2023 of about $340 billion. China's surplus with America was about $270 billion. So we have a larger trade surplus in goods with the United States and China. That is just can we use the word bullseye? That became a bad word to use here, but anyways, it is a red flag, a red cape to Trump. So we're deeply worried that even if the NATO side may have room for despite Elbridge Colby's comments that we need to, and J.D. Vance's comments about Ukraine, not our war, that there'd be a way to sort of massage that and manage our way through it. But the trade and the tariff part, we're deeply worried about. Only thing I'll say is the UK is the only country to have a goods deficit with America. So, in the G7. So the UK can sit back.
At some point, I'm going to come back and ask you about the UK.
I just threw that in en passant.
I can't resist. But before staying at this large scale, it looks to me like the UN is functionally frozen, probably for the rest of my life. I hate to say it, but I hope not yours, but certainly mine. Security Council can't function. So the question is, where do we have an engine, a constructive engine for global governance?
Yeah.
Now, you refer in your book to expanding the G7. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit more about what your thinking is here.
Yeah. Well, John, like you, I think I even have a chapter title called The End of Multilateralism. So, we can come back to that later, but I think we both know why we're saying that, and it sounds like we share our views on it. Of course, multilateralism, at least if you think of it as global, was never entirely global, and the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade, was only for 40 or 50 countries to start with. It expanded. It was a brief moment that the WTO really did have a governance system, but the IMF was always led, and still is, and has shareholdings that are dominated by the US and the EU. I mean, it's fair enough for the Chinese to say, is that really multilateral? So a lot of things we talk about as multilateralism, we're always skewed in the West's, and I will use the word the West here, which I generally avoid, but the West's favor. So was there ever a heyday of multilateralism? It's been very brief in that post-Cold War moment, and maybe in a moment when we defined whatever it was earlier on, before the Cold War got into full swing. What I talk about in the book is, but workarounds. Everyone is involved in workarounds. That wonderful Don Rumsfeld phrase, which I like. And everyone's doing workarounds. The Chinese are doing workarounds with BRICS, but the BRICS is really, I think it's a bit naive, and the expansion is kind of, I don't get it. It's a bit bonkers. I can explain more about it later on. I explain it in the book. But the one place where BRICS does have sense is the New Development Bank, which is a mechanism at least to provide frameworks for trading without relying on the dollar. Not reserve currency, not anything else. And that's why I think you've got the big queue of 34 countries wanting to get in. So that's one type of workaround. Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a kind of regional security coordinating group for countries in that broader Asia space that is a bit of a workaround to the lack of a functioning UN Security Council. Some of the trade agreement, regional trade is doing pretty well. I mentioned it, CPTPP, RCEP, there's now an African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The EU is pretty aggressively trying to pick up trade agreements here and there, so I can see some workarounds taking place there. And our workaround, and I come to the end, and somebody sort of said, why do you suddenly go to we? What's all this we should do this, that, and the other end? This book is written as a member of the Club of Liberal Democracies, fully paid and signed up. So we, if we're going to have a sustainable strategy to deal with the new Cold War, we who share the values but also share the willingness to put money behind it and support each other's security, which is the G7 members. And remember, G7 includes the EU. It is the 8th member of the EU, not in the number. And like you, I think, as some others, I'm a strong believer of engaging, however we want to do it, much more formally and regularly, Australia and South Korea. That is a powerful club that I've got the stats in there, represents however much of global GDP, trade, patents, and importantly with Australia, rare earth mineral access, importantly with South Korea, semiconductors, batteries. This is the kind of supply chain where we would want to trust and rely on each other in ways that others don't. So I think the G7, to my mind, is part of that kind of workaround. And the G7 is a sort of counterbalance, was meant to be a counterbalance to the emerging Russia-China grouping, certainly would be a counterbalance to emerging Russia-China-Iran grouping. I'm not sure if it's a counterbalance to the New Development Bank, because that includes countries that we want to partner with. But I think together, and this is my last part of the puzzle, we need to accept the G7 doesn't lead the world. It is almost a defensive club, or a club where we aspire to higher level standards of supply chain standards and what it takes to share data and terms for that and regulatory standards. If others want to join that later on and can fully subscribe to those values, I'd be open to making it a larger club. If not, it's defensive and we can protect ourselves. But the key question for the new Cold War is how do we engage with everyone else? So I think the G20 has become and is the really interesting potential global governance club.
Why? Because India has played it very cleverly. India is saying to China, you do not get to lead the global south. You can play around with BRICS, but enlarged BRICS is not the global south. And they've had this slew of chairs of the G20. It's gone Indonesia, New Delhi, Rio this year, I think it's South Africa the year after. They, over China's objections, put climate change on the agenda. Over China's objections, they've got foreign minister coordinating meetings. They are deliberately trying to amplify it into a grouping that in a way can sit there and play between the G7 grouping and the Russia-China sort of maybe BRICS-y thing. And I think we need to lean into almost India's view of that, not tell them what they should and shouldn't do, but look for areas of cooperation, engage, and I think G20 is a kind of steering committee for global governance.
But, but India went out of its way to keep the word Ukraine out of the last communique.
Yeah, and
I mean, so they took the largest issue dividing the world and made sure that it wasn't on the table.
But I don't
is
think
that, I mean, is that...
I honestly, John, I don't think it's the largest issue dividing the world. It's the issue that divides us from Russia and to a certain extent China, but the rest of the world doesn't care about it. And maybe they should, because it is changing borders by force, which is the fundamental pillar of international order. The problem is we conflate the word international order with liberal rules-based international order, which is an abusive term because we've been so famously double standards about it that they don't buy it anymore. And they whenever we say international order, they say, you mean liberal rule-based international order where America picks some things and not others, and Iraq, and they throw all that stuff back at our face. My view is, don't use the G20 to major on Ukraine. Ukraine, I'd love other countries to be in there and be upset about it, and they probably should be, given the precedent set. And if you're sitting in the Philippines, you should care about, or Indonesia. But the reality is, they don't want to be engaged, and they're not. So we use the G7. If you want to be a signed-up member of the G7+, you should care about Ukraine. And they do, and they're doing the sanctions, and they're part of the supply chains. But if you're Brazil, or Indonesia, whether you're a democracy or not, let's get them onto our side by helping them move up the value chain economically. Let's get them onto our side by having better offers on infrastructure. Let's not tell them, you know, why aren't you signing up to Ukraine? I remember Bali, we kind of ambushed China and Russia and got Ukraine, a strong Ukraine statement on the Bali G20 summit. In India, I spoke to several diplomats. The Indians didn't want it because they wanted to sort of, you know, play both sides a bit more, and we consciously pulled back. Diplomats went, this is not worth expending political capital. We want to get something positive out of it. And what did we get? Okay, it's theoretically positive because it hasn't happened yet, but we got the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, a big push for the G7's global partnership on infrastructure and investment, trying to come up with an alternative to BRI. It's nascent, it's late, I know, and obviously with Gaza it hasn't happened yet, but at least it was like a more creative way of thinking about how we manage the Cold War.
I've used almost too much of, I've used too much of your time, and we've got a little bit of time left for questions. Do we have a microphone for, did we prepare for that? Doesn't look like we did. Okay, I'm going to keep asking questions.
I'll hear him.
So let me, Robin, I'd like to come back to this question of governance because, you know, the value of the United Nations was that it had normative qualities. It helped speak to the world we wanted to design, the world that was going to be solving problems. And we all benefit from flying around the world because ICAO has rules that are accepted worldwide. I mean, it's, you know, so it was good for all of us. We have, you know, the WHO, people can condemn the WHO, but it did more to deliver life-saving vaccines in the global south than we did, you know. So these normative institutions have value to us. All the complex problems in the world are horizontal and all the governments are vertical. You know, so how do you solve horizontal problems with just vertical governance? But somebody has to lead that. And the question is, can you create normative standards when Russia and China are going to be in the G20?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I see it, again, I see it slightly differently. To my mind, the institutions you just described, ICAO, WHO, you could probably put the WTO in there too, in my mind at least, are functional, not normative. They are about functionalism, in a way, if I go back to my international relations theory time, and I know we have some high school students here and so on that, which is ways of being able to integrate trade and, as you said, human interaction for moving around the world and all that sort of stuff. And there is no reason why functional organizations shouldn't be able to continue and actually operate in a very rivalry, even new Cold War world, as they did, ICAO, WHO to a certain extent, during the last Cold War. Mm-hmm. Now, some sensitivities around China, COVID, America, you know, so, but there are other spaces where even since then, on response mechanisms to pandemics, not necessarily to sequencing or spotting the viruses, where China and the US have carried on working. Obviously, it's America that's, in a way, put the kibosh on the WTO by rejecting the appellate,
No, that's true.
The appellate court. And I'm,
true.
I suppose, always surprised that an American Congress would ever accept extraterritorial decision-making on trade. I mean, Britain left the EU almost to stop having to do that. So maybe that was an international organization too far. But I think there is room for functional coordination that allows international cooperation and globalization even to take place, even in the context of the new Cold War. Normative, to me at least, is that we had an idea, we the democracies, after the horrors of the Second World War, to say that functional without values is a weak structure. It's a castle whose foundations could collapse any moment. So we linked the global peace and functionality with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that ultimately, if you're going to have international cooperation, it's not enough simply to do the functional stuff, because that was pre-World War I. We had high levels of global trade. Everyone thought it was great. And then horror, yeah? So we said there has to be two sides to that coin. Yes, we do functional integration, but we all need to sign up to certain basic principles, and I list them in the book. But they include respect for the rule of law, respect for individual rights of human rights, respect for freedom of expression. I mean, you look at the list, it's a powerful, beautiful list. We are absolutely contested, and this new Cold War is two sides. That is absolutely not accepted. And so what China is trying to do in the multilateral normative institutions, Human Rights Council, but even UN Security Council, internet governance, is trying to excise the values part of the deal that we learned through the horrors of World War II are absolutely indispensable, and just have the functional bit and think everything will be all right. Well, our experience is it isn't. So, and back to the G7, if other people don't want to be part, you want to go play NDB, BRICS, good luck. We are committed to the interlinkage of those two things. Now, I could come up to US presidential elections and so on, if I go back to that again, and whether those norms are absolutely baked in, but I just think the American political system, whoever wins the next presidential election, is a manifestation of separation of powers, contestation, and transparency. So that doesn't undermine at least my thesis on it.
You've made a very strong case for a G7 becoming a G9, I think, with that. So, okay, we got to hear about the UK. I mean, you guys just had a big election. This is the last question, folks, so we'll get you out of here. You'll have something to drink.
I'll answer questions over drinks, as we haven't done it publicly. Sorry, there's one question there, but
so, you know, you had 14 years of Tory rule, 14 years of pretty static economic growth. But Labour's inclination is to think of the power of the state. What do you think happens now with a new Labour government?
Luckily, we've only got 2 minutes left, so yeah, I'll try to be very quick on this. I think you can roll back to the loss of productivity. The Blair period, which was gorgeous, and in that sense, we had pretty above average EU growth rates and so on, but it was slightly on the back of fumes of credit. So the reason we suffered so heavily when the financial crisis happened, more than some parts of continental Europe, way more than Germany, is that we'd lost some of our productive capacity even before the Conservatives came in. So I think this is a bipartisan problem. We had not invested in education, infrastructure, more creative forms of driving economic growth. R&D, our investment levels have been low for even longer than the Conservative government. You can blame the Conservative government for not for the austerity they did after the financial crisis, but for then not using the period of low interest rates to sort of borrow and invest for the long term in infrastructure. We could have done that, and they should have done that. But I think both parties failed Britain and baked in some of our underperformance of the last certainly 10 years, certainly on productivity, where we're absolute laggard on those routes. What does it mean for Labour? Look, everyone's into a more industrial policy approach, and it's partly tied into the geopolitics. That the experience of COVID and the geopolitical environment we've described is such that you're not going to want to rely on unfettered globalization to drive your future economic growth, because as we discovered with Russia, and we could discover with China, that could get cut off at the knees. So there's this kind of hope that, I don't know, just like you did Airbus with industrial policy, that's created good jobs, it's been a pretty successful example of industrial policy, why shouldn't you be able to do that with other sectors as well? The key thing is, have we learned the lessons of the 60s and 70s? You don't pick winners, you create enabling environments. The enabling environment would be tax breaks for capital investment and R&D investment, not creating national champions. And the fact is we don't have enough money, thankfully, to be able to invest in companies. What they're trying to do, they've set up a sort of great British, there's a global GB Energy bank, there's another national welfare fund. These are like 7 billion, 4 billion, think of what you guys put in, minuscule amounts of money, but they are nonetheless going to be tried to use to leverage private sector money, changing rules for pension funds to be able to use sections of their investment to put into long-term funding. And what they're saying is, we have a stable government for 5 years, probably 10 given the scale of our victory, and we're not, crazy Labour. We are the sort of Tony Blair type Labour that's going to be responsible, and we're committing not to raise taxes on this, that, and the other. They'll do it in certain areas: carried interest, private equity, property taxes. Some taxes will go up, but they're trying to say we're disciplined, but we're going to protect workers' rights. We'll change some of those things, union rights, scratch some of the itches of the more socialist part of the Labour Party, and the great thing is, great, probably not term, the rest of Europe ain't looking so great. I mean, so we have this, France was basically eating our lunch, and now maybe France isn't eating our lunch. They're lucky they got a bit of distance from Brexit. Suddenly we're looking like we might do, try to recover some of the deals with the EU that'll make investing in Britain a bit more attractive. We've got some better rules on investment. I just saw today the government saying that it was not going to follow the EU on one of its latest policies. Okay, sorry, it's escaped my mind right now. In any case, it's very consciously trying to find a middle way and be attracted to foreign investment. So this government's going to be all about creating an attractive environment for foreign investment, trying to make Britain attractive for that, and by stealth, become more successful.
Well, this is not a big book, but it's a rich book, and I hope all of you will pick it up. There is a QR code for you to order it. Would you please thank Robin with your applause? This was really quite splendid. Thank you. Really good.